Hi, everyone. You are getting ready to listen to the lecture slides pertaining to mate selection, or I think what we probably more likely refer to as dating. You'll notice that this particular module is broken down into three sections or three major questions. And so in this particular file, we will attempt to answer the question, what factors influence mate selection? But in addition to this file, other files in this module include what are different models of mate selection, as well as is cohabitating before marriage a good idea, why or why not. Ultimately, this module examines the romantic relationship dyad within the family and simply tries to kind of figure out why are we attracted to who we are attracted to and what explanations can we offer to kind of figure out that question. So hopefully you have noticed that at the very beginning of this module, I asked you to complete an online survey. If you haven't already taken this survey, please just hit pause and take a minute and do that. And the survey won't take very long at all. It's only 5 questions, but I'd like for everyone to take some time to do that and so that I can kind of compile the results and present you with some class data. The results will be anonymous, so I won't link your name to any of your answers, but I think it'll be really interesting if we can have everybody in the class answer those questions, and then we can look at the results together. Okay, so if you haven't already done that, please take a minute to do that. All right, though, let's begin. Okay, so as I mentioned before, this particular set of lecture slides is focused on the question of what factors influence mate selection. So in other words, what are some specific variables that might influence who we are attracted to and why? So what we'll be doing in this section is kind of breaking the factors down into 3 categories: individual factors, couple factors, and then contextual or environmental factors. So let's start with looking at some individual factors. Before I actually advance to the next slide, this would be a good time to think about the question that you hopefully answered in our online survey that was first. If you'll recall, that question asked you to think about what the characteristics of your ideal mate are and to list all of those characteristics. So this would be a good time to kind of go back and think about what all was on your list, or hopefully at this point I've also had a chance to post some of the responses that your classmates offered, so you could take a look at some of the other characteristics that your classmates identified as important characteristics. According to your textbook, some of the most influential factors that influence mate selection include things like age, relationship experience, relationship beliefs, family of origin, and other types of mate preferences. Right. So I don't know that I'll go into a lot of details regarding all of these factors, but I want to just hit a couple of important ideas. Starting with age. We talked about age a little bit when when you looked at the information regarding some family demographics at the very beginning of the semester. And one thing that I think is interesting to note is that in that data, we did discuss the fact that people in general are waiting to get married. Both males and females are older now on average when they first get married than just a few decades ago. But what's interesting is we do not see people waiting to engage in romantic relationships. So the age in which people first start dating is not going up. So I think that's really important to think about. People are still engaging in romantic relationships. People are still dating. But people are simply dating longer, I guess, right? They're waiting they're delaying marriage. We've already discussed a variety of reasons for that, and I think we'll examine that even in more detail in our next module when we actually specifically study marriage and long-term romantic relationships. Relationship experience or relationship readiness also seems to be a really important individual factor that influences mate selection. My guess is many of you have lots of stories to share about this regarding how your own personal relationship experience or the maybe lack of, or the relationship experience or lack of experience of your partners may have influenced some of your romantic relationships. But one thing that I think is particularly interesting to think about when we think about this factor is not just previous relationships, but how did previous relationships end? So in other words, imagine if you are currently dating someone and you think about how the relationships prior to this relationship ended for either you or for your partner. And think about, well, does it matter how the previous relationship ended? Does it matter if it was a total messy breakup and your current romantic partner was the one that got dumped? Or maybe even they were the dumper, I guess I could say. Or does it matter instead if the relationship ended in kind of in a mutually agreeable way, right? Does the way the relationship ended influence your now current relationship? Well, there's a lot of data out there that suggests, yeah, in fact, that it does have impact. In fact, I think this is a little counterintuitive, but in fact, what the data suggests is when people, when their relationship ends in a mutually agreeable way, in other words, they kind of, let's say, agree to be friends, that they actually tend to be, that these people tend to be less ready for a future relationship than people who were dumped or who broke up in pretty black and white fashion. If you really think about it, I guess it makes sense though, right? What the argument is that if you break up in a way that is kind of mutually agreeable and you agree to still be friends, that can come with a lot of ambiguity, right? And that can still mean that there might be some undefined roles or lack of clarity about what the two of you actually mean to each other. And then if we carry that forward, it's not surprising to think that some of that ambiguity or lack of clarity might find its way into your next or into your current relationship, enhancing and being problematic, right? If your romantic partner is maybe still thinking that the door might still be open from that previous partner, or may not have had total and complete closure from that previous romantic relationship, they may simply be less ready to be in their current relationship. Okay, so relationship beliefs also seem to be factors to that influence mate selection. I think your book does a good job of pointing out specifically how something like attachment style could be relevant. We know that when people have positive views of self, particularly if they have a secure attachment style, but also a dismissive style, we know that those people tend to find romantic relationships more satisfying. You might take a minute to think about why that would be. I think that's pretty interesting. My argument would be that if you have a positive view of yourself, then that means you tend to think, I do things well, right? I am a good friend. I am a good romantic partner. I'm a good parent. And if you see yourself as being good in those roles, you are inherently going to find those roles more satisfying and more enjoyable, right? On the other hand, if you tend to have a negative view of self, because perhaps you have a preoccupied or a fearful attachment style, and you don't see yourself as a good friend, or you question why your romantic partner would ever want to be with you, then you're probably going to find the relationship a lot less satisfying. If you don't think you're very good at it, it's just not as enjoyable. Okay. We know family of origin plays a major factor in mate selection. We tend to repeat patterns, whether they're positive or negative. We tend to repeat the patterns that we grew up in our adult relationships. We saw some examples of that when we watched the video for the improving family interaction, right? But we can think of a lot of other ways in which people might find themselves intentionally or unintentionally recreating the patterns that were developed in the family of origin or the family that they grew up in. Okay, so let's just kind of a brief look at some of those individual factors. Again, I encourage you to make sure you are reading the textbook and that you are kind of reviewing all of these factors in more detail as well. Now, it's interesting to think about these individual lists and whatever characteristics might be on your particular list for an ideal romantic partner, but we also need to think about mate selection in terms of not just individual factors, but also couple factors, right? Or dyadic factors. When we do this, we're not just looking at an individual characteristic, but instead we're looking at compatibility and how two people might be compatible or not. Right, so this might be one way to think about it. On your individual list, you might have various physical characteristics. You might have identified something like, I want my romantic partner to be tall, or I want him or her to be short, right? But if we think about mate selection in terms of couple factors and compatibility, it would then, if we're still talking about height, it would sound more like, I want my partner to be taller than me or shorter than me, right? So now I'm kind of looking at this same variable, but looking at it in terms of a couple or a compatibility, in terms of compatibility. When we think about couple factors, it's hard to ignore a couple of really common sayings or axioms in our culture. I'm sure you have all heard the phrase opposites attract before. Maybe you've used that phrase even. In addition to that, though, maybe a little bit less common, but another phrase that we sometimes hear when we think about compatibility is this idea of birds of a feather flock together. Or if you haven't heard that, maybe you've heard the phrase like attracts like. So obviously the first saying, opposites attract, suggests that it's good to be really different from your romantic partner and to be opposites. On the other hand, the other sayings, whether it's birds of a feather flock together or like attracts like, that either one of those sayings is suggesting that similarity is actually important, and similarity is necessary for compatibility. If we were in class, we would take time to debate this, right? We'd hopefully have a good conversation about which saying or sets of saying you think are more accurate. So I encourage you right now to think about that a little bit on your own. Which do you think is more accurate? And maybe even examine the reading, right? And think, what does the data say is more accurate? So I encourage you maybe hit pause and think about that for a few minutes. All right, assuming you have taken a few minutes to do that, the reality is if you have to pick one side, and if you look at what the data suggests, the truth is birds of a feather flock together tends to be more accurate, right? Now, of course, it is important to point out that there is some level of variability, right? Usually when we're talking about similarity, we're talking about things that honestly sometimes people overlook. Right? For the most part, people are attracted to other people that are, for example, the same age, right? Similarity in age. People also tend to be attracted to people that have similarities in terms of education level, or perhaps even other socioeconomic variables, right? Now, a lot of times what happens when I ask this question is people automatically jump to personality traits. Right? I'm extroverted and my partner is introverted, and so we're opposites, and so that really works. And that makes sense. And certainly I can think of a whole host of examples where that might be true. I have tons of friends where that might be true. But when that comes up, I usually ask people to back up a little bit first, though, and I say, okay, that makes sense. But now wait a minute. You and your romantic partner, are you about the same age? Are you both college students? Did you both grow up in small towns or those types of things, right? And usually what happens is all of those, there's all kinds of similarities in terms of those variables, but then we see, after all that stuff is matched, then we start to see some differences or some opposites in terms of personality characteristics. Okay, but again, the reality is that this idea that opposites attract might seem really appealing, but in the case of long, sustainable relationships, generally speaking, we find that similarity is a good predictor of partner compatibility. Now, your book offers a couple of different explanations for that, and so I think it's important to get those down. One explanation is referred to as reinforcement affect. And so this idea of reinforcement affect is simply the idea that we really like it when people reinforce our affect or reinforce our emotion. Right? It feels good when people agree with us or support our beliefs. Right? If I'm up giving a presentation and the presentation is a persuasive presentation about why, let's say, marijuana should be made legal, odds are I'm going to like the audience members that are nodding their heads and agreeing with me and reinforcing my beliefs more than those audience members that might be frowning at me or shaking their heads or disagreeing with me. Right? It just simply feels good when people agree with us. So reinforcement affect is one explanation for why we tend to be attracted to people that are similar to us. I said there were two explanations, so let me offer you the second one. The second explanation is called the repulsion hypothesis. The repulsion hypothesis argues that we are, I guess, kind of repulsed when people don't agree with us. More accurately, what it's really saying is we tend to assume people think like us, right? It's just kind of human nature to assume that people would respond in the same way to a situation and think, oh yeah, everybody kind of thinks the way I think. And so when we find instances where that's not true, we are surprised. We are kind of shocked, and we don't like it, right? It kind of catches us off guard. I don't know if this has ever happened to you or not, or if you can think of a specific example, but I can certainly think of a lot of times where I maybe have gotten fired up about something at work, and I just am like, can you believe this happened? And I'm so upset about it. How dare anyone say that or think that way? And on my way home from work, I'm thinking about how I'm going to tell my husband about the situation, and he's just going to jump on board with me. And yeah, I can't believe it, Jennifer. And then I get to talking, and it turns out he kind of plays devil's advocate, or he disagrees with me. And I'm like, what? I can't believe you disagree with me, right? And turn kind of annoyed, right? I'm shocked that someone would that you would disagree. That kind of rubs us the wrong way, essentially. Right. So just make sure you're familiar with these concepts of reinforcement affect and repulsion hypothesis as two ways to explain why similarity tends to be a good predictor of compatibility, more so than opposites attract. Okay, now I want to show you kind of an interesting example here. Oh, let's hope the video plays. Of one way in which we do attempt to match. Your book refers to this idea of assortative matching. Right, or finding something that's similar to us. And this particular video looks at matching, or I guess specifically assortative matching, in terms of physical appearance. And so it's just a 2 or 3 minute video, but let me give you a chance to watch this particular study in action, and then we can kind of debrief it once it's done.
The numbers drawn at random are meant to represent desirability, 1 being least and 10 being most. In the real world, where most of us don't know exactly how attractive we are, 10 aim high, trying to snare a 10. Then, usually, we move lower down desirability scales. All the 2 people who fought curl up with one another. Wasn't like the 10 is perfectly matched and the 1 is perfectly matched. But to compare that to formation,
Okay, so I hope you found that kind of interesting, right? And again, what we can see is it's supposed to represent a really sped up version of mate selection and assortative matching. You know, ideally, we try to seek out a mate that is as attractive as possible. We'll talk about that concept a little bit more in the next lecture when we look at evolutionary psychology's explanation of mate selection. But we're looking for a mate as attractive as possible, but we don't want to or we know we can't always get the most attractive mate, right? It's not possible for everyone to get the most attractive mate. So instead, what winds up happening is we wind up matching with someone who shares a relatively similar level of attractiveness as we do. Right? The particularly attractive people are able to be more selective. The not as attractive people are maybe not quite as selective. Right? But data tends to indicate that there is at least some kind of correlation in attractiveness between partners. Okay. By the way, if you found that video kind of interesting, it comes from, you can see there, The Science of Sex Appeal, which is a documentary that's super interesting and just chock full of various studies that examine the mate selection process, primarily from an evolutionary psychology perspective, but just in general, they offer a lot of insight about mate selection. So if you think that's really interesting, you can find it on Netflix, and you can find clips of it all over YouTube, so you might check those out. Okay, so our final factor that we're going to be talking about, our final category of factors that we're going to be talking about for mate selection is the contextual factors or environmental factors. And so you can see that those are factors that are kind of outside the individuals in the relationship or outside the relationship itself, right? First and foremost, one of the biggest factors that affects mate selection is simply proximity. It's not a particularly romantic notion, but the reality is one of the biggest predictors of who we pick or who we match up with in terms of romantic relationships is how close we are to that person. Geography or proximity, right? You are infinitely more likely to be in a romantic relationship with a fellow SVSU student than you are with someone who lives in California and goes to Berkeley, or someone who lives on the other side of the world, right, and lives in Australia. We tend to pair up with people who we are in close proxemics with, right? And it makes sense. It's people that we actually have the opportunity to interact with. Now, as we will talk about, and as you can see, kind of the third item there is certainly technology has influenced that. Our society is much more global than it ever was, and we have various forms of technology and social media and dating apps that might influence the importance of proximity, but still, it still holds true that you are simply more likely to be in a relationship with someone that is in near proximity to you than someone who is not. Social networks are also an important factor in mate selection. That's simply suggesting what your friends and family think of your romantic partner is important, right? My guess is all of you have experienced either being in a relationship with someone that your friends or family didn't really care for, or perhaps you have had a friend or a family member that was in a relationship with someone that you really didn't like. And if we had the opportunity to talk about that together, my hunch is we would all be able to come up with examples of how hard that was and how awkward it can be, and really the strain that can be put on either the friendship or the family relationship or the romantic relationship when there are people involved that simply don't like each other. Right? So your social networks do influence mate selection. Your book points out that in some cases we like to think that that there might be something kind of romantic about being in a relationship with someone that your friends and family don't care for, that you can kind of frame it as an us against the world kind of situation, and there can be something kind of intoxicating about kind of overcoming that circumstance. But your book goes on to kind of refer to this thing called the Romeo and Juliet effect, right? Obviously, Romeo and Juliet found themselves in this situation where their families did not approve of the relationship and intended to just persevere and overcome that. But as your book points out, we kind of know how that turned out, right? So for long-term romantic relationships, social network support is pretty important. And then I already briefly kind of mentioned technology. We know that certainly can play a role in how or who we may pick to date. I think your book offers some really interesting examples of this, and especially when it comes to dating apps, they offer some additional insight. So I certainly encourage you to check that out. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up here. At this point, we have covered various factors that might influence dating or mate selection. You'll find in the next couple of sets of lecture slides more information regarding specific models of date selection, and then also information about cohabitating and dating.